The United States government can spend money it does not have, print the money it needs, and then buy back the debt it created. No private citizen, no business, and no bank on earth can do what Washington, D.C. does with its own currency every single day. Welcome to the Market Antiquarian, where history and finance reveal how the world really works. Subscribe to stay informed. To understand this system, you must first walk into a quiet building in Washington, D.C. called the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Inside that building, massive printing presses run day and night, producing sheets of green dollar bills by the billions each year. The smell of fresh ink fills the air as workers in that facility stack and count bills that will soon move across the entire nation. But here is what most people never think about when they hold a dollar bill in their hand on any ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That dollar bill is not really money in the traditional sense. It is a note. It is a promise. It is a piece of paper backed by trust. Before 1971, a dollar bill represented a fixed amount of gold sitting inside a vault at Fort Knox in the state of Kentucky. Citizens could theoretically walk into a bank and trade paper dollars for real gold bars at a guaranteed and fixed exchange rate. President Richard Nixon stood before television cameras in August of 1971 and changed that arrangement forever in one single speech. Nixon told the American people and the world that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold at any fixed price. Gold bars remained inside Fort Knox, but they no longer backed the paper money that workers at the Bureau of Engraving were printing. From that moment forward, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, meaning its value rested entirely on government trust. Now the government could print more dollars whenever it needed to, without worrying about running out of gold to back each new bill. And here is where the story gets truly interesting, because printing money is only the first part of a much larger three-part system. The second part of this system involves a building in New York City on Liberty Street, home to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That limestone building holds one of the largest gold vaults on Earth, buried 5 stories below the streets of Lower Manhattan. But the real power of the Federal Reserve is not in that vault. The real power is in its ability to create money through lending. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency, and it is not a private company. It occupies a unique legal space between both worlds. Congress created the Federal Reserve in 1913 after a series of devastating bank panics left ordinary Americans losing their savings. Before 1913, if your local bank in Ohio or Georgia failed, your money was simply gone. No insurance, no rescue, no safety net at all. The bank panic of 1907 was so severe that J.P. Morgan personally invited top bankers to his library in New York City to stop the crisis. Morgan locked the doors of his private library on Madison Avenue and told those bankers they were not leaving until they solved the problem. That one moment in a private library showed Congress that the nation could not depend on one rich man to save the financial system alone. 6 years later, in December of 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law inside the White House. A new central bank now had the authority to lend money to other banks, set interest rates, and stabilize the financial system nationally. But the Federal Reserve does something even more remarkable than just lending money. It creates money from nothing when it issues loans. When a bank borrows from the Federal Reserve, new digital dollars appear on a balance sheet. No printing press runs, no paper moves. This process is called money creation, and it has been the engine behind nearly every major economic expansion in modern United States history. Think of it this way. Imagine a library that can conjure new books from thin air every time someone asks to borrow one. That is the Fed. The books still carry real information. People still read them. But the library never had those books sitting on a shelf before the request. Now, you understand the first 2 parts. The government prints money through the Treasury. The Federal Reserve lends money into existence. The third part is the part that makes most people stop and stare at the ceiling, because it is genuinely hard to believe it is real. The United States government actually buys its own debt. It issues bonds, and then it buys those same bonds back through the Federal Reserve. This process is called open market operations, and it has been used consistently since the mid-20th century to manage the economy. Here's how it works in plain terms. The Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. needs money to pay for roads, military, and social programs. The Treasury cannot simply print money whenever it wants. It must first get approval from Congress to borrow up to a legal debt ceiling. Once Congress approves, the Treasury issues bond certificates, official government promises to repay borrowed money with added interest later. Those bond certificates go to auction, where banks, foreign governments, and pension funds from around the world line up to purchase them. China, Japan, and dozens of other nations have historically held hundreds of billions of dollars worth of these United States Treasury bonds. When a foreign government buys a Treasury bond, it is essentially lending money to Washington, D.C. and waiting to be paid back with interest. This arrangement has made the United States dollar the dominant global reserve currency for more than 7 decades running. Central banks from London to Tokyo to Riyadh hold dollar-denominated bonds as the safest and most stable store of national wealth available. But what happens when not enough buyers show up at the bond auction and the Treasury still needs to raise billions of dollars that same week? This is where the Federal Reserve steps into the picture and performs the action that critics call printing money and buying your own debt. The Federal Reserve goes into the open market and purchases Treasury bonds that were already sold using newly created digital dollars. The sellers of those bonds, usually large commercial banks, now have fresh digital dollars sitting in their reserve accounts at the Federal Reserve. Those banks can now lend more money to businesses and consumers, which pumps more spending and activity into the broader national economy. The Federal Reserve used this exact tool during the financial crisis of 2008, when housing markets collapsed across the United States. Rows of empty houses lined quiet suburban streets from California to Florida as banks stopped lending and the economy began to contract fast. The Federal Reserve launched a program called Quantitative Easing, purchasing trillions of dollars worth of bonds and mortgage securities. Between 2008 and 2015, the Federal Reserve balance sheet grew from roughly $900 billion to over $4 trillion in total assets. Critics argued that creating this much new money would cause prices to rise rapidly and destroy the purchasing power of ordinary workers. Supporters argued that without this intervention, the United States would have entered a depression deeper than anything seen since the 1930s. Breadlines and bank failures of the 1930s remained in living memory for economists advising policymakers in Washington, D.C. in 2008. The Federal Reserve chairman at the time was Ben Bernanke, a scholar who had spent decades studying the Great Depression at Princeton University. Bernanke had written about how poor Federal Reserve decisions in the 1930s turned a recession into a lasting national catastrophe. Now, Bernanke sat at the head of the table inside the Federal Reserve boardroom and had the power to act on everything he had studied. He authorized bond and mortgage security purchases on a scale the Federal Reserve had never attempted in its entire history before 2008. Interest rates fell to nearly 0% as the Federal Reserve flooded commercial banks with newly created digital reserve dollars. Mortgage rates across the country dropped, businesses began borrowing again. The stock market in New York City began a long, slow recovery. But the question that historians and economists still debate today is whether the government was truly managing the economy or distorting it. When a government can print money, lend money into existence, and buy back its own debt, who exactly is setting the price of everything? Interest rates are the price of borrowing money. When the Federal Reserve pushes rates to zero, it changes the price of every asset on Earth. A house in Phoenix, a factory in Detroit, a bond in Tokyo, a pension fund in Oslo all become more expensive when dollar rates drop to zero. This is not conspiracy or speculation. This is the documented and measurable outcome of Federal Reserve policy tracked across multiple decades. The Federal Reserve publishes its meeting transcripts, its balance sheet data, and its policy decisions on its official public website. Any person with internet access can read the minutes of Federal Reserve meetings and trace exactly how these decisions were made over time. This transparency is actually one of the most remarkable things about the system. The mechanism is hidden in plain sight for anyone willing to look. So let us take a moment to trace the full circle of this system from the very beginning to see it clearly as a complete, connected loop. Step 1. Congress approves a budget that spends more money than the government collects from taxes in that fiscal year. Step 2. The Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. issues bond certificates and sells them at auction to raise the needed funds. Step 3. Some bonds go to foreign buyers, some to domestic banks, and some eventually end up on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. Step 4. The Federal Reserve creates new digital dollars to purchase those bonds, expanding the money supply across the entire economy. Step 5. Banks hold more reserves, lending increases, businesses expand, people spend more, and the economy grows in measurable ways. Step 6. The government collects more tax revenue as the economy grows and uses some of that revenue to pay interest on its bonds. Step 7. When the Federal Reserve eventually sells those bonds back into the market, it removes money from circulation and contract supply. This is the loop. Print, borrow, buy, expand, contract, repeat. It has been running continuously since the early 20th century. The national debt of the United States crossed $1 trillion for the first time in 1981 during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. President Reagan signed legislation from the Oval Office that raised the debt ceiling as national spending on defense and programs increased. By the year 2000, the national debt had grown to roughly $5.6 trillion, and interest payments alone consumed a large portion of the budget. By 2023, the national debt had crossed $33 trillion, a number so large it is nearly impossible to visualize in any human scale. If you stacked 33 trillion $1 bills flat on top of each other, that pile would reach more than 2 million miles into space. That is roughly 8 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon, all built from paper promises issued in Washington, D.C. over decades, and yet the system continues. Bond auctions still happen. Foreign buyers still show up. The Federal Reserve still holds trillions in assets. The dollar remains the world reserve currency, and global trade from oil to semiconductors to agricultural goods is still priced in dollars. This is not an accident. This is the result of deliberate policy choices, historical timing, and geopolitical agreements going back to 1944. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war global financial system. They agreed that the United States dollar would serve as the anchor currency for world trade, a decision still shaping every economy today. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 did not happen by accident. It happened because the world had just watched 2 global wars destroy entire economies. Delegates from 44 nations carried leather briefcases into the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July of 1944. Outside those hotel windows, World War II was still being fought. Soldiers were still moving across the beaches of Normandy in France. But inside the hotel conference rooms, economists were already designing the financial architecture of the world that would come after the war. The lead American negotiator was Treasury official Harry Dexter White, and he arrived with a plan to make the dollar the center of everything. Across the table sat British economist John Maynard Keynes, who wanted a neutral international currency that no single nation could control. Keynes pushed hard for a new global currency he called the Bancor, which would sit above all national currencies, including the dollar and the pound. White refused. The United States held the largest gold reserves on Earth and the most powerful economy, and White intended to use that leverage fully. After weeks of negotiations inside the hotel, Keynes walked away defeated, and White walked away with exactly the arrangement he had come to win. The dollar would become the world reserve currency. All other currencies would peg their value to the dollar. The dollar alone would peg to gold. This meant that every nation on Earth now needed dollars to conduct international trade, creating permanent global demand for the United States currency. Oil from the Middle East, steel from Germany, rice from Southeast Asia, copper from South America, all of it was priced and traded in dollars. This gave Washington, D.C. a privilege that no empire in history had ever enjoyed before. Economists later called it the exorbitant privilege. France called it unfair, and French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing stood before reporters in Paris and used those exact words in the 1960s. France argued that the United States could print dollars, send them abroad to pay for imports, and then never truly feel the burden of overspending. A French citizen paying taxes in Paris was indirectly helping finance American government spending in Washington, D.C., and the French government knew it. But the system held together because every nation needed dollars more than they needed to complain about the arrangement openly or loudly. The Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union was building nuclear weapons and expanding its influence across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Nations that depended on United States military protection could not afford to undermine the dollar system that funded the American defense budget. And so the arrangement continued. Dollars flowed out of the United States. Foreign goods flowed in. Treasury bonds piled up in foreign central banks. Then, in the late 1960s, the weight of that arrangement began to crack under the pressure of 2 enormous expenses happening at the same time. President Lyndon Johnson was simultaneously funding the Vietnam War and a massive domestic spending program called the Great Society from Washington, D.C. Soldiers moved through the jungles of Vietnam, while construction workers built new hospitals and schools across American cities at the same time. The United States government was spending far more than it was collecting in taxes, and the gap was being filled by printing more paper dollars. Foreign governments began to notice that more dollars were circulating than the gold stored at Fort Knox could possibly back at the fixed rate. France became the most aggressive challenger. President Charles de Gaulle sent French naval ships to New York Harbor, carrying accumulated francs. Those ships carried paper dollars that France had accumulated through trade. De Gaulle demanded that the United States exchange them for real gold. He stood at a podium in Paris and told the world that paper promises were not acceptable. France wanted the gold that those promises represented. Other nations watched closely. If France could demand gold, anyone could demand gold, and the United States did not have enough gold for everyone. The gold window was closing. The math no longer worked. By 1971, the United States held roughly $10 billion worth of gold at Fort Knox, but foreign governments were holding over $60 billion worth of claims against that same gold. The gap was enormous and growing every month. President Nixon gathered his advisors at Camp David in Maryland over a weekend in August of 1971 to make a decision that would change everything. Treasury Secretary John Connally sat across from Nixon at the Camp David conference table and made the argument plainly and directly. Connally told Nixon that the dollar was a problem for everybody, but it was only the tool of the United States, and the nation should use that tool. On the evening of Sunday, August 15th of 1971, President Nixon appeared on national television from the Oval Office and spoke to the American people. He announced that the United States would immediately suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold, ending the Bretton Woods arrangement. Gold bars sat untouched in the vault at Fort Knox as Nixon spoke. The promise that those bars backed every dollar was now officially gone. Nixon called it a temporary measure. It was never reversed. The world has operated on a pure fiat currency system from that Sunday night forward. In the days following the speech, currency traders in London and Frankfurt and Tokyo scrambled to understand what the dollar was now actually worth. Without a gold peg, the dollar value would now float against other currencies in a global market, where supply and demand set the daily price. This was the moment the modern financial system was truly born, not in a vault, not in a gold mine, but in a televised speech on a Sunday evening. Now the Federal Reserve could expand the money supply as needed without any hard physical constraint on how many dollars could be created, and the Treasury could issue as many bonds as Congress authorized, knowing the Federal Reserve stood ready to purchase them if demand fell short. This combination, the printing press, the bond market, and the Federal Reserve, as buyer of last resort, became the foundation of modern government finance. Critics called it a license to spend without consequences. Supporters called it the flexibility needed to manage a complex modern economy responsibly. What is beyond debate is that the national debt grew dramatically in the decades following 1971 compared to everything that came before that year. In the 37 years before Nixon closed the gold window, the national debt grew by roughly $400 billion in total across multiple presidencies. In the 37 years after Nixon closed the gold window, the national debt grew by over $9 trillion, more than 20 times as fast as before. The printing press did not go idle after 1971. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C. kept running, and the numbers kept climbing. But physical paper was only part of the story. The larger expansion of money was happening digitally inside the balance sheets of banks nationwide. When the Federal Reserve buys a Treasury bond from a bank, it does not send a truck of cash. It simply types a number into a computer system. The bank balance increases. The Federal Reserve balance sheet expands. New money exists that did not exist the moment before the keyboard was pressed. This digital creation of money is legal, documented, and published in public Federal Reserve reports, available to anyone who visits the official website. During 2020 and 2021, the Federal Reserve created more new money in a single year than it had in the entire previous century combined. The global health crisis of 2020 brought economic activity to a near standstill as businesses closed and workers stayed home across American cities. The United States government needed to send direct payments to millions of households and keep businesses alive during an unprecedented shutdown. Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, authorizing roughly $2.2 trillion in emergency spending in March 2020. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin sat before Senate committees in Washington, D.C., explaining how the government planned to fund this historic package. The answer was the same answer it has always been. The Treasury would issue bonds. The Federal Reserve would stand ready to support the market. Between March and June of 2020, the Federal Reserve balance sheet expanded by roughly $3 trillion in just 3 months of emergency action. Dollar payments moved through the banking system as government checks landed in mailboxes across every state from Maine to Hawaii and Alaska. Grocery store shelves were restocked. Rent was paid. Small businesses in cities like Chicago and Dallas and Seattle stayed open a little longer. The immediate crisis was softened, but the long-term consequence was a money supply that had grown faster than the supply of goods and services. By 2022, the price of groceries at supermarkets across the country had risen sharply. The price of renting an apartment in major cities had spiked. Workers in offices and factories looked at their paychecks and then looked at price tags and felt the gap between the two growing wider each month. The Federal Reserve responded by doing something it had not done aggressively in over 4 decades. It raised interest rates sharply and quickly. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., and announced a series of rapid interest rate increases through 2022. Each rate increase made borrowing more expensive. Mortgage rates climbed from roughly 3% to over 7% within a single calendar year. Families sitting at kitchen tables across the country found that the house they could afford in January, they could no longer afford in December. Home sales slowed. Office buildings in San Francisco and New York City sat partially empty. Construction of new apartments slowed nationwide. This is the other side of the loop. When the Federal Reserve expands money, prices can rise. When it contracts money, economic activity can slow. The government does not simply print and spend without ever feeling tension. The tension arrives later, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later, and the debt itself carries a cost. Every $1 trillion of national debt generates tens of billions of dollars in annual interest payments. By 2023, the United States government was spending more on interest payments on its debt than on the entire national defense budget combined. Interest payments on Treasury bonds from Washington, D.C. were flowing to bondholders in New York, London, Beijing, Tokyo, and Riyadh every month. The money printed in Washington, D.C. was circling the globe and returning as an obligation that future taxpayers would be asked to honor. History shows us that no reserve currency has lasted forever. The British pound held that role before the dollar. Before the pound, the Dutch guilder, each of those currencies rose to dominance through economic and military strength, and each eventually gave way when that strength began to fade. Historians who study the archives of the Bank of England can trace the exact decade when the pound began losing its grip on global trade leadership. The dollar has held its position for over 80 years, longer than any previous reserve currency in the modern era of global paper money finance. Whether it holds for another 80 years or begins a transition in the decades ahead is a question that economists in universities worldwide still debate. What is certain is that this system is real, documented, publicly accessible, and more fascinating than any story a writer could invent. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C. will run its presses again tomorrow. The bond auction will open again this coming week. The Federal Reserve balance sheet will shift again before the end of this month, as it has shifted every month for over a century without stopping. Somewhere in a glass-walled trading room in New York City, a bond trader will watch a screen and place a bid on the next Treasury offering. You have now traced the full loop from the printing press in Washington, D.C. to the bond desk in Lower Manhattan, and all the way back again. You have seen how a speech by President Nixon in 1971 severed the last link between paper money and physical gold sitting in a Kentucky vault. You have seen how the Federal Reserve creates money digitally and how that money flows through commercial banks and into every corner of the economy. The paradox that opened this story is not a trick. It is the actual operating reality of the most powerful financial system in human history. The past still has stories to tell. Subscribe and let us uncover them together.